excited to be introducing Caitlin Littlefield. She is our plenary speaker for today. Dr. Littlefield is a senior scientist at Conservation Science Partners, where she leads the Changing Landscapes Lab. Caitlin is a broadly trained research ecologist and works at the intersection of forest ecology, conservation biology, and climate adaptation science. She works with land managers and planners across the country, from the U.S. Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, and National Parks, as well as numerous state agencies, to understand how forests and wildlife are responding to global change and to jointly craft and deploy climate adaptation strategies. Prior to her current position, Caitlin taught in the UVM forestry program, conducted research at the University of Vermont, and received a PhD from the University of Washington and a master's from the University of Vermont. Caitlin lives in Richmond, Vermont, where she has planted hundreds of trees along the Winooski River and is now the town's tree warden, following multiple years of service on the Conservation Commission and Town Forest Committee. So thank you so much, and welcome, Caitlin.
Thank you for the introduction, Al, and many thanks to the NESAF Planning Committee for the honor of being able to speak to you all today. Really excited to share the work we have, and also really excited to learn from you all as well. Our panel discussion afterwards, and as well as from questions and insights that you all might have. So I'm really excited to share this work. Please pick up a copy at the registration table. Everybody can have one. And to set forth a possible vision for how we might keep our forests forested and protect the countless values we derive from our forests, all while sustainably meeting our wood product needs. And although I'm the one standing up here today, this was quite the team effort over the past few years, and I'm enormously grateful to my co-authors. And so in particular, Brian Donahue, calling you out for the countless hours we spent steeped in multi-tabbed, garishly color-coded Excel spreadsheets. Thank you. Paul Catanzaro, who unfortunately is no longer able to make it today, David Foster, Tony D'Amato, Ken Lawson, and Brian Hall as well. So really, this was a team effort, and greatly improved by multiple thoughtful reviews as well. So I'd like to take a moment to give an explanation for what's a pretty provocative title, and to be clear about the legacy that we're seeking to build upon today. So the illusion of preservation, that is not a new term. That came from this right here, a 20-year-old study out of Harvard Forest that set forth what you see in its subtitle, a global environmental argument for the local production of natural resources. And this argument rested on a paradox that the authors of this paper laid bare. It was focused on Massachusetts. And what they said and what they showed was that Massachusetts, while very justifiably proud of its abundant forests and rich history of conservation leadership, produced almost none of its wood products, well less than 10%. And so, of course, preservation of more wild places is warranted. Absolutely, we need more of those places. But the author said, unless we are also addressing our massive volumes of wood consumed and reorienting where some of that wood production comes from within our borders, rather than getting our wood products from outside, beyond the borders, where we can ignore the environmental consequences or social consequences of potentially bad practices. If we're not also doing that, then that preservation is simply an illusion. So instead, the study suggested we must simultaneously advance the preservation of intact wild places, intact wildlands, while also conserving sustainably managed woodlands to establish a better balance between our production and consumption. So following this publication, targets for that balance started to take shape, first for Massachusetts, then for New England, and even more recently, encompassing farmland and communities too. And so it's within that integrated vision of wildlands and woodlands that we've returned to the paradox originally set forth in the original illusion of preservation. And we're extending it from Massachusetts to all of New England. And one last thing I want to note there. In our own title, you'll note that we're keeping that term, illusion of preservation, in quotation marks. And that's pretty darn intentional. That's, on the one hand, to give credit where credit is due, and to really honor the good work set forth in this groundbreaking work, but also to hold it a bit at arm's length. Because we're not in this work trying to create more polarization, And we're not looking to cast aspersions on the thoughtful work of our colleagues who are trying to protect more wild places. We need more big, vast wild places and smaller reserves, passively managed reserves peppered across the landscape. But what we're trying to set forth in this work is to show just how compatible and, in fact, imperative it is that we have both passively managed wildlands and actively, sustainably managed woodlands as well to meet our wood product needs right here in New England, both wildlands and woodlands. And so that's my caveat about the title of our work and a bit of the legacy that we're guided by. But if I had to sum up our motivation for revisiting this work now, 20 years later, it's really encapsulated by this. 2 words here, carbon, okay, more than 2 words, forest carbon and public lands, and the debates that are playing out on our public lands right now, and mounting pressure to curtail harvesting in the name of maximizing ecological values, and especially the capacity to store carbon. And that's crucial. We absolutely need more carbon kept out of the atmosphere and in our forests. In this era of unprecedented climate change, I personally find it so heartening that there is broad societal recognition of the magic of photosynthesis and carbon fixation. So rightfully so, people are looking to our forests as an important natural climate solution. So these are land-based pathways that keep carbon out of the atmosphere and are crucial to helping us mitigate climate change as we also reduce fossil fuel use. And forests are right at the top when it comes to their climate mitigation potential. So take a look here, and I won't walk through this entire graph, but in terms of the ecosystems and practices that we can implement that will leverage natural processes to help keep carbon out of the atmosphere, we're talking about reforestation on lands that had formerly been forested, avoided forest conversion, and forest management. These are huge contributors in terms of climate change mitigation potential, as well as yielding other important co-benefits like protecting biodiversity, ensuring clean air and water, and healthy soils as well. So keeping more carbon in our forests is key. However, a singular focus on maximizing carbon across the board can really obscure any number of trade-offs. And I'm going to focus here for a minute on just giving a handful of examples of potential trade-offs. So what you're looking at on the left there are a couple examples of natural communities in which less is more. Less carbon is in fact more. So pitch pine systems, pitch pine barrens, early successional northern hardwood stands, and then further west towards the Great Lakes, an example of some oak savannas is there, historically maintained by frequent fire. So in each of these systems and others, more above ground carbon at the stand level is not necessarily compatible with restoring or maintaining the habitat conditions that a range of taxa require, including imperiled wildlife species. At a landscape scale, maintaining this kind of diversity across the landscape can equate to greater adaptive capacity and also reduce the risk of more carbon loss in the case of, for example, high severity disturbances. So that's one example of an ecological trade-off. There we go. Another one relates to the fact that higher carbon stocking levels can also, in some contexts, contribute to more density-dependent mortality, whether from moisture stress, invasive insects, or other factors. And in fact, some forest carbon project protocols that are out there actually incentivize some of these levels or call for levels that are higher for eligibility purposes. So what you're looking at here in this figure, we're looking at the frequency of forest inventory and analysis plots broken out by hardwood, softwood, and different site classes. Those plots that meet or exceed some of the basal area thresholds in this particular protocol, and those are in orange, and the ones that don't meet those basal area thresholds in teal. And so what you can see there is that more carbon loss is due to mortality in those plots that exceed or meet or exceed the thresholds, whereas there's reduced mortality and carbon loss in those that aren't quite getting that dense. So once again, the push towards packing more in might inadvertently contribute to even more mortality. And similarly, we might see in places where there's higher density or more accumulated above ground biomass could contribute to accumulated fuel loads that exacerbate, for example, fire severity. So just a couple ecological examples there and disturbance ecology examples. How about some economic and social considerations? So reduced harvesting whether in the context of formal forest carbon projects or not, can have dramatic implications for the local workforce and timber tax revenues. These are open questions surrounding, for example, the Connecticut Lakes headwaters situation, as the talk is called for tomorrow that Charlie Levesque will be discussing. And then as it pertains to our conversation today, reduced harvesting in one place may exacerbate the illusion as we seek to keep carbon out of the atmosphere, if we're simply bumping our production elsewhere while continuing to consume wood products at the rate that we do. So let's bring those trade-offs back to the public lands. And that's where some of these trade-offs, ecological, social, economic, are frequently obscured as pressures mount to curtail harvesting, especially on state and federal lands, again, to maximize their ecological values and particularly that capacity to store carbon. From the moratorium on logging in state lands in Massachusetts to debates surrounding state lands, as right here in this photo, the Worcester Range here in Vermont, pressure to curtail harvesting is mounting across the region. And we wholeheartedly recognize the importance of passive management and how necessary it is to expand wildlands as well. However, that strategy by itself is going to fail to provide the full suite of benefits that we require from our forests here in New England and beyond. If we reduce harvesting within New England while maintaining our high levels of consumption, we're just shifting that wood production elsewhere, including to other parts of the world with weaker environmental and social oversights than exist in much of New England today. And that leakage overall, speaking of carbon, that leakage might do very little to reduce the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere if we're simply curtailing harvesting here and it's happening elsewhere. It's simply extending the illusion. And so that's really what motivated us to revisit that original document. And to ask this question, today, is New England producing as much wood as the region consumes? And what about each state? I'm going to briefly step through some of the data sets and methods that we used to answer this question, along with some of the necessary assumptions that we made. And I'm happy to go into more detail during the question and answers. So we took a net balance approach to examine how our production compares to our consumption, and also to see where recovery, however small, fits into the equation. And to be clear, we really weren't going for a full accounting, but what we wanted to do was provide a very reasonable estimate of what potential imbalances look like, the size and the shape of them, which can help us to identify some of the opportunities to address those imbalances. So let's start with consumption. We drew our consumption estimates from the Forest Service's Forest Product Laboratory. So we have national per capita rates of forest product consumption. We multiplied those by the number of people in each state and then scaled those by each state's income. That's how we arrived at our lumber consumption and our pulp consumption. As for fuel wood consumption, we couldn't, in fact, find reliable estimates of how much fuel wood is consumed in New England, so we simply made the assumption that what's produced in New England is consumed, that same volume is consumed. All right, on to production. So as for production, we explored various data sources, including state reports as from Maine and Vermont about harvested volumes, but all told, we elected to use the Forest Service Forest Inventory and Analysis data because it's standardized across states. Recent inventories were available, and we had Ken Lawson and his keen eyes to help us crunch the numbers on the FIA data, former state biometrician from Maine. So that's how we arrived at production of lumber, pulp, and fuel wood for each state. And then there's one final piece, fairly modest, the equation, wood recovery. So we used published data on the volumes of wood recovered from construction and demolition and from municipal solid waste, and what's left on the table as well in those classes. And we parsed that mostly into fuel, a little bit into pulp, and then a tiny amount into lumber. Sum those all up, and that becomes our net balance. And across these three buckets, consumption, production, and recovery, we necessarily made a few simplifying assumptions and simplifications. And so I'll mention a couple of them briefly here, but again, happy to go into more detail. So for example, we assumed that the average saw log in New England, 2/3 of it goes to lumber, 1/3 of the waste ends up going into the pulp stream. We also necessarily, we had to simplify and combine hardwood and softwood here as well. And so these are just a couple of the assumptions that we had to make to arrive at this big picture. So let's take a look at how we are doing. All told, New England produces about 3/4 of the wood products consumed within the region. That's nearly 60% of the lumber and about 80% of the raw material for paper. And I'm saying raw material for paper because, as I just mentioned, we're assuming some of saw log waste goes to that pulp stream as well. So what you're looking at on the left is production, on the right is consumption, and then that y-axis is volume produced as well. Let's add a little more nuance to these components here. So consumption is parsed into lumber and that paper raw materials. Production includes a tiny amount of recovery from waste streams, pulp removals, and saw log removals, and those are distributed again into lumber and pulp to be used in paper. We're not showing fuel wood here because, as I mentioned, we're assuming that those volumes cancel out production and consumption. So you might look at this, somebody might look at this and say, okay, 3/4, that's pretty good for a region. But it's the disparities within New England, between New England states, that are particularly striking and really show that the illusion is operating within the region. So collectively, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island produce well under 10% of the wood consumed in those states, despite being roughly 60% forested. New Hampshire is closer to parity, and Vermont produces about half again as much as consumed. Maine produces about 325% of what the state consumes. And so in fact, about 70% of the region's production occurs in Maine, and 70% of the consumption occurs in southern New England. And that's logical in many ways, right? There are far more people in southern New England, and so of course total consumption is higher. But there is room for that part of the region in particular, and especially with regard to lumber production, to do more. We've got about 2 acres of forest for every New Englander, and that's roughly the ratio of forest to people for the entire country, the United States as a whole. And the US as a whole is pretty close to hitting a net balance in terms of its production and consumption. So we can step it up. This imbalance doesn't need to persist, and we suggest it certainly doesn't need to be exacerbated by shunting our production elsewhere. We can move beyond the illusion to produce more of our wood products consumed here in New England, and we can do it well in ways that are consistent with and in fact propel us towards meeting urgent climate change and biodiversity goals. So what will it take to do so? What will it take for New England to move beyond the illusion and sustainably produce as much wood as we consume? So we set forth 3 steps towards doing so to be achieved by 2060. That's protecting forests, reducing consumption, and extending ecological forestry. I'll walk through each of those. First step, protecting forests. Permanently protecting New England's forests, at least 10% of the landscape and wildlands, and 60% in ecologically managed woodlands. And this is crucial because right now we are permanently converting about 30,000 acres of forest every single year in the region to non-forest. And that's a pretty worrying loss given the incredible rebound of our forests over the 19th and 20th centuries. So this is a story everyone in the room is familiar with. After decimation of the region's indigenous populations, and that asterisk is a woefully inadequate symbol meant to demonstrate that no, the population of New England was not in fact zero upon the arrival of the European settlers. But those settlers steadily cleared the forests of southern and central New England, while the northernmost parts of the region were oriented towards the industrial extraction of timber and pulp. And then, of course, with agricultural abandonment in the mid-19th century into the 20th century, that allowed for the rebound of forests up until the last decades of the 20th century. And that's when our forest cover started to wane again. And that decline is due to suburban sprawl and low-density development, including that which perforates the forest. And so that photo in the middle there is from Stowe, Vermont, not far down the road, down 89, where you see houses crawling up the hillside, which is not high-density development, but that kind of perforation really compromises the ecological integrity and connectivity of the forests. And then also, a fair amount of open land loss is going to renewable development. An Audubon report from a few years back found that a full quarter of natural land conversion in Massachusetts over a 5-year period was due to solar development. To be clear, we have to deploy more renewables, but let's just not clear our forests to do so. If we don't substantially ramp up protections, forest will continue to be lost. And I think this vulnerability is really lost on many people. Your average New Englander could look out their window and see hillsides blanketed in trees. And it's true. About 80% of our land area is forested, but only a quarter of the landscape is protected from conversion to non-forest. So we need to do two things here: decrease the rate of forest loss and ramp up those protections substantially. And again, we're calling for at least 10% of New England to be protected in pastly managed wildlands, and another 60% to be protected in actively managed woodlands. So that is step one. On to step two. This is reducing consumption. So we're aiming for a 25% reduction in lumber consumption by 2060. Given future population and housing projections, this is a pretty reasonable estimate and target. Housing starts and lumber consumption, as you might imagine, are pretty tightly intertwined, and the region as a whole is actually projected to see a slowdown in population growth and housing starts by mid-century, and therefore, plausibly, a reduction in lumber consumption. This could change if we have another pandemic. It could change if we see more climate refugees fleeing California and landing here. But it's a solid, reasonable target, even as we need and strive to address crucially, our affordable housing needs. And we can do that with local wood. So that photo in the lower left there, that's an example of a multifamily, affordable, passive housing building in Lewiston, Maine, constructed from local wood with the support of local woodworks. And shout out to Ken and Lloyd Erlin. They'll be giving a talk on local woodworks later on today, talking about how we can better use local wood in projects just like these to address our housing needs. And we certainly have some room to improve with single-family houses as well. This isn't just multifamily houses. In 1975, here's some trivia that really blew my mind. In 1975, the average single-family house in the Northeast was about 1,600 square feet. It's now nearly 2,800 square feet, even as families have gotten smaller. So reducing that footprint can mean a further reduction in material consumption. We're calling for a 25% reduction in paper consumption too. Right now, our paper use in the US is about 4 times the global average. Let's reorient some of that pulpwood to more durable, innovative uses. Wood fiber insulation, engineered wood products like mass timber, as shown in this design building at UMass. In many cases, wood is going to be preferable to other carbon-intensive materials: steel, concrete, plastics, polystyrene. So it's possible that as we adopt more wood, more engineered wood products, for example, that we'll in fact see, we won't see quite the reduction that we're in consumption that we're speaking to here. So that's one other variable. But I want to be clear that even though we're focused on a reduction in wood consumption here, the same argument is absolutely warranted for all material consumption. We must reduce our fossil fuel use, and of course plastics, polystyrene, steel, concrete. We are awash in stuff. And a lot of that stuff ends up in the waste stream. And so as part of this step, we're calling for increasing our wood reclamation for municipal solid waste in construction and demolition, as well as increasing the percentage of paper that comes from recycled materials. All right, that's step number 2. On to step number 3. The final step is to expand ecological forestry. And in a minute, I'll talk about just how much acreage that will be required to meet that reduced consumption that we're talking about. So in the words of Tony D'Amato and his co-author, ecological forestry a goal is to sustain productive, healthy forests with native species diversity and a full array of ecosystem services by managing them in ways that bring them closer in structure, function, and composition to healthy natural forests at all stages of successional development. Tony will be giving a talk on that tomorrow. So we're harvesting wood products in ways that emulate natural patterns and dynamics while sustaining the full array of ecological values that forests afford. So a focus here is on promoting natural forest conditions: large snags and down wood, a diversity of tree species and sizes, canopy layers, and gaps, rather than maximizing total yield in the short run. And so ecological forestry might not produce as much harvestable wood as rapidly as intensive plantations or short rotation forestry, but it does produce a steady output of long-lived wood products that are often of higher market value while protecting other forest values. And that's why we're seeking to expand ecological forest management across the region. Even so, even as we advocate for that, we acknowledge that this expansion might be challenging in some contexts. So for example, on corporate ownerships where high rates of return might be expected on shorter time horizons. And so in such cases, auxiliary revenue, as from forest carbon markets, maybe that'll help. So here in the photo on the right, that's from AMC's Maine Woods Initiative. And some of that carbon revenue is helping to support management focused on establishing higher stocking and restoring structural and compositional complexity on lands that were previously heavily harvested prior to acquisition. But all told though, even with other streams of revenue like that, to expand ecological forestry to the degree that we're calling for, we're likely going to almost certainly need to see greater consumer willingness to pay premiums for such wood products. And that fits into the broader cultural shift around our relationship with forests that I'll come back to. And I do want to digress for a second to answer what might be a very logical question some of you were asking. So expanding ecological forestry from what? How much acreage is currently being managed in ecological forestry or currently managed at all? And briefly, we simply don't know the answer to that question. We don't have a great handle on how much land is currently under management across the region as a whole. So state reports on silvicultural activities and harvested volumes, forest cutting plans from Massachusetts, those are all really helpful resources, but they're not standardized or even available across all states. Plus, a snapshot of harvesting activities in any given year doesn't actually tell us how much land is under active management. And that same goes for example, looking at forest inventory analysis, re-inventories. We can get snapshots of harvesting activities, but we don't have a full picture across the region of how much land is under active management or in more specifically ecological forest management. So I think a standardized region-wide effort to do so would provide important baseline information as well as a means to hold ourselves accountable as we strive for these goals. Okay, so those are our 3 steps: protecting forests, reducing consumption, and expanding ecological forestry. Let's come back to that question, though, of how much wood could ecological forestry sustainably produce, and how much acreage is needed to deal with our consumption that we projected for 2060. So we have applied a broad conservative estimate to answer that question. On average, by 2060, we think that ecological forestry could produce an average of 0.4 cords of wood per acre per year, with 60% of that in saw logs and 40% of that in lower grade wood. That ratio, 60-40, it's the inverse of what our harvests across the region today. So to meet our wood demands in 2060, we need about 8 million cords annually, and that's going to require 20 million acres of New England forest land under ecological forest management, just under half of New England's land, or under 2/3 of our forests. So where does that 20 million acres come from? After withdrawing wildlands, remember 10% of the landscape, we're calling for just over 50% of public lands, the public land acreage in each state, just over 50% of the family forest ownerships in each state, and about 100% of corporate lands in each state in 2060 to engage in active forest management, and that will enable us to meet our goals. And again, that 50, 100%, those are all after we've withdrawn some of the landscape into wild reserves. 1 million acres from family forests, 1 million acres from what's currently corporate land, and 2 million acres from public lands. And to be clear, this is just one possible scenario for sustainably meeting our regional needs. Let's see how it shakes out in terms of our net balance. So to return here to these equations, we've reduced consumption, we've increased the recycled content and recovery in our wood products, and that means we'll see a modest reduction, in fact, in our production. But we're reallocating more of that production, more of that lower grade material to lumber. And I do want to comment on that specifically, because you might recall that in the 2020 schematic, we were talking about fuel wood, and now in 2060, we're talking about other low-grade materials. That's because we might strive to shift away from immediate carbon-releasing combustion in some contexts and reallocate some of that lower-grade material towards more durable carbon-storing products. But we certainly, to be clear, we certainly still anticipate continued use of wood, especially in rural areas, as a source of heating and even electricity generation. I am keeping my wood stove. And so here's what 2060 looks like. Maine is still a disproportionate producer for the region, but southern New England states are getting closer to producing about a quarter of the wood consumed therein. And overall, as a region, we're now in net balance. So let's compare that to where we were. Now we're looking at the region-wide numbers for 2020 compared to 2060. Production are those two bars on the left, consumption, the two bars on the right. And as you can see, our overall consumption has declined pretty dramatically. And accordingly, production has seen a modest decline across the region as a whole. And again, I realize that might give folks some pause, but we're reorienting production away from lower grade to higher grade. And we're seeing more soil removals in 2060 than we were in 2020. That represents increased stumpage values and could foster or reinvigorate value-adding supply chains in communities oriented around the forest industry. Easy, right? Yeah. Now, how do we get there? This is the tricky part, of course. And we don't have a clear roadmap on this, but we do have an inkling of some of the broad trends that are needed, and our panelists will speak to more of that as well. So, especially in perhaps northern parts of this region, getting to this 2060 vision is going to require substantial near-term public investment in the workforces and infrastructure necessary to reinvigorate forest-based economies and especially to reestablish low-grade markets. In some areas, this might go hand in hand with the growth of outdoor recreation economies in parts of the region too. And it's also going to require addressing some of those open questions I alluded to earlier surrounding carbon markets, and especially how the growing enrollment of large parcels in carbon markets might affect local communities and the tax revenue, not to mention the potential to perpetuate leakage of production elsewhere. How about for public lands? So achieving the 2060 vision is going to require a widespread embracing by the public of the key role that public lands play. So pardon the Vermont bias here, but the images that you're looking at are the Worcester Range, which you'll hear about tomorrow from Danny Fitzko, Green Mountain National Forest, which Jay Strand will speak to, and then Heinsberg Town Forest with Ethan Tapper, who will be hosting a field trip to one of our town forests nearby on Friday. So these public lands can serve as models for a balanced approach to passive and active management. Both large and small, these tracts are key anchors in our protected area network and have disproportionately high ecological and social values. And they can really encompass both big, vast wilderness areas and smaller reserves, along with active, sustainable management to meet our wood product needs. These lands are subject to long-term planning, considerable oversight, and public input as well. They can serve as training grounds for loggers and contractors who might then carry those good practices elsewhere, serve as demonstrations for ecological forestry for landowners, and as a place for the public to both explore wild places and find refuge there, as well as to better understand where their wood products come from and what active sustainable management can look like. But finally, and perhaps the trickiest part of achieving this 2060 vision is going to require the engagement of family forest owners on an unprecedented scale. So imagine this. Take a look at these maps by Lena Clifford, who's going to be speaking later this afternoon about family forest attitudes towards passive management. These light green parcels are state and conservation organizations parcels in Massachusetts. These are private parcels. And after accounting for wildlands, what we're calling for is over 50% of family forest ownerships engaging in active ecological forestry. And that is a lot. That's nearly 3 million cords of woods that we're envisioning from these lands, or about 35% of the region's production each year. And that's on par with the victory gardens of World War II, when American families generated about a third, if not more, of the nation's produce in their own backyards and gardens. So we need that scale of engagement. And that's going to require a substantial cultural shift. It is perhaps the trickiest part of moving beyond the illusion of preservation. Because to date, incentive programs have failed to engage a substantial portion of family forest owners in active forest management. But we're not starting from scratch. We have many excellent examples of family forest owners who are engaged in excellent active management, and many who seek to extend that stewardship and that relationship with their land to others. So here's a great example that Paul, again, he can't be here today, but shared with me. Just a little ways to the southeast of this map is Conway, Massachusetts. And that's where Tony and Ann Borton, after learning that their land and neighborhood weren't technically identified by the state as in a high priority habitat, they decided it was still well worth protecting their land and placed a conservation easement on it that continued to allow them to carry out active management. They then had their neighbors over for pie and coffee to tell their story of why they protected their land. This spurred enough neighbors to do the same, such that a full about 1,000-acre block abutting a mass wildlife WMA ended up being conserved. And so as Paul said, that is the power of pie and coffee right there. And then here's Tim Stout and his wife Nan and their 175-acre parcel in Shrewsbury. And I know Tim is somewhere out in the audience today. So Tim was perhaps the first landowner in Vermont, probably number one, still not entirely sure, to enroll in the Family Forest Carbon Program under one of their active management protocols. Tim has hosted multiple field trips for other landowners and created and compiled countless resources for other landowners online. So he's the kind of neighbor that you want to have, not just because he's a great neighbor, but also because of this neighbor-to-neighbor and peer-to-peer knowledge sharing and the relationship building that will be crucial to engaging family forest owners on this scale that we've not yet seen. And that's the theme that I'd like to end on, that theme of relationship and engagement. In fact, the theme of this conference. So we're talking about relationships to the land as well as relationships to one another. And these relationships require us to recognize that our actions, what we do and what we don't do, in our own backyards and on our public lands, all have ramifications that extend beyond parcel boundaries, across the region, and in fact to the planet. So never before in the history of humanity have our little monkey brains been forced to confront these planetary scale problems and the looming trade-offs and unintended consequences of our actions or inactions. And that's hard, confronting those challenges. And I think it's so very tempting then to latch on to a single mantra. Maximize carbon here or bust. No harvesting here or bust. But that simplicity really obscures the complexity that's just deeply key to our totally interconnected world and, in fact, our reliance on forests. The notion that no active forest management is the most environmentally sound approach one can take and that all harvesting, especially on public lands, ought to cease, that notion, coupled with the loss of tens of thousands of acres of forest each year, is only exacerbating the ecological and ethical costs in a world where natural resource consumption is simply a fact of life. We need a balanced approach, passively manage wildlands and actively, sustainably manage woodlands, and we desperately need to protect both. Despite the logic and the need for that balance and the inherent complementarity of passively managed lands and actively managed lands, we're seeing increasing polarization and debates around how to manage our lands. But just as these lands are on common ground, we need to find that common ground too. Too much is at stake to do otherwise. So a few weeks back, I was in DC for the SAF summit on the science surrounding old growth management, and to help the Forest Service chart a path towards stewarding old growth on our nation's public lands. And I know some folks in this room were at that summit as well. So a key theme at the summit, one that we heard especially from tribal community members, was rebuilding relationships with the land and with one another. And especially in that room, because there were many attendees who included folks that had been at odds since the timber wars in the 1990s, wilderness or bust tree sitters on one side and logging industry representatives on the other. So recognizing that potential for divisiveness, Phil Rigdon of the Yakama Nation shared a really beautiful lesson, and I asked if I might share it today too. His people have lived in the Cascade foothills and on the central plateau of Washington along the Columbia River for ages. And he told us that his people, when they are in mourning, they do not hunt or fish, as the sadness would then be conveyed through the food to the people, which is supposed to instead nourish them. Similarly, Phil said to us, we cannot confront these issues of how to steward our forests when we are angry. And I would like to extend that lesson here to New England, to all of us who are engaged in dialogue or debate around forest management, especially on our public lands, folks in the room and folks who are not in this room. Let us not approach the question of forest stewardship in New England from a place of division and digging in our heels. Let us not imbue our solutions with strife and stridency, and instead let us pursue a thriving forested landscape in finding our common ground in both wanting to and really needing to keep our forests forested, and in recognizing and even celebrating our age-old reliance on forests here in New England and elsewhere. Thank you. And with that, I'd like to invite our contestants up on stage.